Every time I talk to my friends, I always say, anytime I ask you how you're doing, I always want the long answer. I don't want the short answer, you know?
Okay.
You
I
know,
got you. I got you.
yeah, yeah, yeah. By all means, I really want to know how you're doing, where you're struggling, where you're thriving, where you're still questioning. I mean, sometimes we kind of just ask that question in a roundabout way and don't wait for the real answer. So I'm sitting here waiting for that real answer.
I'll give you the real one. So work is tough, but life is rich. And what I mean by that is if I had to choose what kind of wealth I wanted, I want to believe that 7 lives over, I'll choose the wealth that I have, which is I have really rich, vibrant relationship with my wife. I have really rich and vibrant relationship with my growing kids that are one of which is stepping into young adulthood. And I have really vibrant and rich relationship with friends and family. Despite the fact that I think the economy's weird, the job market is really strange. I've been in what feels like let me see, 5, 6, probably like a 5 to 6 year career pivot. Pivoting in and of itself is already a challenging thing, but it becomes even more challenging when the economy and the labor force is already kind of upended a little bit. I mean, the way that we think about work is changing. So the crux of what I'm trying to say is I'm good in all the ways that I think I want to be good. Life is challenging, job wise, financially, but I think if I had to choose, I prefer to be rich in my relationship. So good. That's why I say I'm good.
Yeah, no, I hear you. I always answer in the same way. I always say that the headline is that all things that are important are in a good place. My health, my family, my spirit, I'm in a good place. But of course, that comes with a lot of other things that are not, that are outside of your control that you wish were different. And, you mentioned the career and workspace being a challenge. I'm in that same space with you. I left my job of 5 years and, sort of stepped back out into entrepreneur life and rededicated myself to a bunch of different projects, but one of them being this work around men and boys and masculinity. And, one of the things that I'm learning, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this is, when you traffic in ideas and when you traffic in any sort of spirit-led work, and I believe creativity is spirit-led work, when you're trafficking in that space, it's a very delicate balance, right? Between sort of putting yourself and putting everything that you are, your entire spirit, your soul into that creative endeavor, and then hoping that what you're doing is of value to someone out there. And
Mm.
so you throw that tension on top of the fact that we are in really interesting times, I would say times of contraction writ large, that feels like a very, very scary place to be.
Dude, incredibly challenging, incredibly challenging. I'll talk a little bit about like my own pivot and
By all
why
means.
that's led me. Yeah, so you know this about my stories and maybe your viewers do or don't, but for almost 2 decades I was a pastor of a Christian church and we can, dive into that later in the
Yeah,
conversation. I know that.
I had tons of questions around that for sure. But
Okay,
yeah, no,
okay.
dig in, dig in.
Yeah, yeah, I know that the conversation of faith communities is not the easiest conversation to have in our modern age. But nonetheless, I was a pastor for about 20 years. And in 2020, I made the decision to transition out of that. My family made the decision to transition from New York, which I was born and raised. We had our 2 kids in New York City, raised them at least up until that point in New York, and we transitioned to Atlanta. I think what's really challenging, and we could pick this apart, is not only that I was making a pivot, pivoting, as I mentioned earlier, is in and of itself a challenging thing, but I was pivoting what felt like a really drastic vocational pivot, right? I was going from kind of clergy, ministry, religious, nonprofit-ish kind of work, and pivoting into the entertainment world, right, in uh, film and TV. But that's only one layer of the challenge, right? The second layer is you have to do a lot of kind of mental, spiritual, psychological, emotional searching about what you even think vocation is. Like, what is
Yeah.
vocation for you? Like, for any Spanish speakers out there, right? It comes from the word voca, which is, what is your calling? What have you been called to? And so, that's another layer of the work that you have to do. But on top of that, and this is to the point that you just mentioned, the way we think about work is also changing, right?
Mm.
So the labor force is also evolving. Similar, and I'm not an expert by any means in around this stuff, but similarly to like the Industrial Revolution, like the way
Right.
we think about work is changing, particularly as it relates to technology, artificial intelligence. So you're making a massive shift mentally, emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, right? From one career to another. You're making a shift from one place to another and all the kind of sociological ties that are connected to that. And then you're having to do all of that while trying to do some soul searching about what you want to do in the second act of life, right? I'm in my 40s. And then on top of that, you're having to navigate just the changing landscape of work altogether. That combusts and it creates a really, really weird, quirky, challenging journey. And so I feel like I've been in that for the last 5 years, not without a level of clarity, but and some anchors along the way, but certainly incredibly challenging.
Yeah. No, for sure. And I mean, you said so much there. I mean, there are AI implications. There is the changing world of corporate America in general that contributes to that changing landscape. There's the rise of the creator economy that now gives everybody
Oh, man.
the
Yeah,
tools to essentially create their own brands and build their own businesses from the comfort of their own home. So
that's right.
all of that, in addition to some other things, is what's creating this new, I would say, paradigm shift in what we call work. So speaking of work and speaking of transformation, you're now in Atlanta, right? It's home. And it's been
Mhm.
home for the last 5 or so years, but I know you across various landscapes. From Washington Heights, it's playing basketball, it's the creative space, it's following each other online. And, I
Mm,
think the common thread, what keeps us tethered in some ways, is that both of our work is rooted in love, right? The
mm,
exploration and the excavation of love. And not just in the romantic sense, but it's really as love as the highest expression, the highest vibration that we can exist in. And so that's what I think is always bringing me back to your work and following your content. And so I want to spend some time there. What
yeah.
is your sort of definition? How do you look at love as it relates to how you show up in the world? Where I'm alluding to your book, right? Mikasa Uptown. I'm gonna put it here, and I'll drop the link in the show notes so that people can grab it. But, the book is about learning how to love again, right? But can you tell us a little bit more about your love ethos?
Yeah. Well, thank you for showing love to the book. I wrote it in, or at least it published in 2017. At the time, I was living in Washington Heights, Uptown, New York, which is kind of a mutual experience for the both of us. But yeah, dude, oh my gosh, not in the romantic way at all. Love, right? When you talk about
Yeah.
the ethos, yes, of course, there is a romantic aspect of that word, but in the work that you do, there's so much about love that isn't romantic. I mean, I wanna argue that at the heart of it, it isn't romantic, right? That it's a decision that you make. My wife and I are going on 19 years married. We've been together 22 years, 23 years. And I don't say that at all to boast, but I do say that to highlight that there have been so many times throughout the years where it's felt romantic, right? That the idea of love has been sentimental. But the idea of love being sentimental is not what's carried us. The idea of love to me at its core is a decision that I make, a decision to and I know we'll get into this and more, a decision to be open, to have a willingness to be vulnerable, a commitment to create a sense of access one to the other. And it's been that decision in the moments where precisely I don't want to be those things that I've been called back to how I understand love, which is it is a decision. Now, look, I'm not trying to I don't want to strip love of its sentimentality. It certainly is a sentiment. It certainly involves deeply our emotions. But I think the part of love that we often don't talk about is the commitment, right? The decision that we make to say, I am going to be here despite what I may or may not discover about you. And I'm hoping that you would make that same commitment to me. And I want to say that that's been what's kept my wife and I in this relationship. The sentimentality and the emotion of that word, love, makes our relationship in the past 23 years very exciting. But and I don't know that I have the right word, but I'll say it this way. While the emotion and sentimentality of love is what made our last 23 years very exciting, it's been our commitment to show up, right? The aspect of love that says this is a decision that I'm making to show up. That's what's made the last 23 years possible,
Mhm.
right? Sentimentality has made it really exciting. The the decision and the commitment to show up for one another. It's what's made it the last 23 years possible.
Yeah.
And I think that's how I understand that word. That's how I've experienced, right? Going beyond what I have kind of like philosophized about that word. That's been the experience when I know I'm not very lovable, but my wife still chooses to love me. I like
Right.
the moments where I am not lovable, where, I'm petty or um
You're your
I'm
lower
not
self.
making an effort. Yeah, I'm my
Yeah.
lowest self, man, and she still chooses to be kind. She's never not honest, you know what I'm saying? She's never not honest, and I also think that's part of love, right?
Yeah,
Being able to
absolutely.
show up honestly. She's never not honest, but she's when she chooses to give me what I know in that moment I don't deserve is wildly impressive to me.
Mm.
And it moves me, actually. It moves me to emulate it, but it also moves me to gratitude. Like, I'm grateful for the way that you are loving me right now, and I can only aspire and give my efforts to doing the same for you. Like, I want to inspire you to say that in your lowest self, when you are not lovable, to use that, it that way, I choose to love you. And I hope that you feel moved by that in the way that you've made me feel moved by your commitment to show up, to be kind, to be generous, to be forgiving when I know I don't need it. And all of that is nuanced, of course.
Sure.
So I'm also not saying that if there's something in one's relationship that requires repair, right, that you shouldn't seek after repair. But obviously this whole conversation requires nuance. But
100%. And you
yeah,
talked about the emotion and the sentimentality of it, but then you ended off with and this is what I heard you say, so please correct me if I'm wrong, but the act of love and the choosing of it, the verb of love, right? We talked about the noun, but the verb of love
mhm,
is the act and the doing. And I think Bell
mhm.
Hooks says it in All About Love. Is like you have to do love. It's not
That's
something that just
exactly
kind of
right.
exists and happens to you. Journey that you decided to go on, and you were
Mm.
sharing vulnerability around sort of how you're not feeling like you're showing up for your family in the traditional sense as a man would normally,
Um,
right? As a provider, as someone who is the man of the house, el hombre de la casa, as it were. And I thought that video was so powerful because, you showed your kids and your interaction with your son. And I wonder, one, what inspired that? And two, through the lens of love and through the lens of showing up, how has that changed this whole journey that you're on? How has that changed the way you love and show up for your family?
Man, yeah. So I think what inspired it is more practical than most people may imagine. Like I was working as a producer at a media company, and I got laid off earlier this year. And I wasn't really tripping. I was like, oh, I'll find work. I've never not had work. I've always been pretty keen on finding work, all that stuff. And so I was like, I wasn't really tripping, but still unemployed currently, right? And I realized I wasn't doing anything. I was doing the best that I could to kind of tap into my networks, doing the job search thing. And I realized I just wasn't doing anything. So practically what inspired it was the itch to create and to take all of the things that I was reflecting on and processing in this season and make something out of it. You know what I mean? And of course, it came on the heels of a lot of encouragement from my wife, from my network of friends, all that stuff. So more practical than more people than I imagine. But also, if I had to give it deep meaning, I would say that something that was really inspiring to me to create that particular video was the power that I see vulnerability carries. So again, pulling on the strings of what I used to do as a pastor. To be very plain, what I did as a pastor for almost 20 years was essentially my job was to tell a story in such a way about this divine figure that promises access to him if you trust. Like, that was my job, whether it was, the liturgy of our Sunday gathering, my sermons, any public speaking attached to it, anything that happened throughout the week, visiting people in the hospital, performing funerals, performing weddings, like all of it. My job was to invite people to this truth that if you trusted in this thing that's much bigger than yourself, you would gain access to something that would deeply mark you and change you to be the kind of person that would make you generous when no one expects it, loving when no one expects it, forgiving when no one expects it. That's what I did as a pastor. I realized how much it took for somebody to actually believe that. So much that my job was to then call them to vulnerability, because in order to trust something like that, you have to show up as yourself. Like, I used to say this all the time, and I say this now to my kids, like, God is not interested. I tell my kids two things. God is not interested in changing the version of yourself where you pretend. He's only
Ooh,
interested in changing you. But in order for that to happen, you have to show up. The other thing that I tell my kids is God only dwells in reality. So if you construct a life that is just a facade to your real one sitting beneath it, don't expect God to dwell in that, because God doesn't dwell in an artificial construction of your life. God dwells in reality. And so I say all of that to say that so much of what inspires that video and a lot of the content that I produce is I cannot invite anyone to this truth that I believe in if I don't first model vulnerability, a kind of openness that's not calculated, because we can jump into this, but
yeah,
vulnerability, transparency, intimacy are all very related, though I think they have slight differences. But also in this era of content production, vulnerability and authenticity are also fabricated for the
yeah,
brand. And I think that if I wanted to cut through the noise for whoever was watching my content, I needed to be vulnerable. I needed to talk about how I was struggling to find work. I needed to talk about the implications of not finding work and having work in a home where I have a kid on his way to college, a daughter in high school, and a married and a wife. Right? How do I perceive my role in this family dynamic if I don't bring money in? And I know that there's a lot of masculine
yeah,
perception there, but I had to really wrestle with that perception of myself and the perception that I think I was constructing that others have of me. And if I can't work, if I can't bring money in, the perception that I thought maybe my wife secretly had of me because I'm not bringing in money. Not to mention that she was not putting that pressure on me, neither were the kids, but I was constructing it in my own head. Like, if I didn't talk about that out loud, personally, in my own times of reflection, because that's another pet peeve I have. Like, I try not to use social media as the testing ground for ideas. Like, I have to process this thing first so that it feels meaningful when I actually present it on Instagram. But the inspiration was like, yo, I I gotta model vulnerability for whoever's watching, even if it's just my kids, you know what I mean? Even if it's my
Yeah.
son scrolling on his Instagram and he sees his dad's post and he has to process the truth and the honesty and the vulnerability of that post, or for whoever's watching. I remember particularly, you sent me a
Yeah.
message and I thought it was very encouraging. It's like, yo, man, whoever's watching, this is the sort of stuff that we need to be putting out. And so
100%.
vulnerability was the inspiration behind that. I cannot imagine my life without leaving breadcrumbs for my kids when they're older to say, Papi was never not honest.
That's right.
Papi
I
was
love that.
never not willing to be vulnerable when they're in their 40s with their own kids, if that's what they choose to, how they choose to build their life. Like, I want them to know that the greatest wealth that they can have is a willing spirit, a spirit that's willing to be honest, a spirit that's willing to trust, and a spirit that's willing to imagine that things could be different than from what they may be living. So it was practical, but it was also,
Yeah.
I guess some deeper meaning there.
Man, so many gems in that, and I want to slowly just kind of peel back the layers of onion of that onion because you touched on so many things, right? Vulnerability, which we'll get into now, the role of men and sort of how we are identified by what we do and what we produce, and how that completely shifted for you on a couple of occasions, right? When you left the church, but also when you were laid off. Want to unpack that.
Yeah.
And then just, the last thing you said around giving your kids modeling behavior for your children is so important. But let's stick with vulnerability for a minute because it's part of what we were talking about just last week, right? On voice notes, we were going back and
Mm,
forth. And I was like, yo, let's just save this for the pod. But, vulnerability and transparency, I think a lot of people tend to conflate those two things. They're related to your point, but they conflate it. So the difference in my view is that vulnerability is a way of being and transparency is an act, is a transaction in a moment.
I
Right? So
love it. Yeah.
vulnerability is to be vulnerable, you have to live on the edge of fear. You have to live on the edge and you have to embody this fearlessness to live on the cusp of not being received or not being held or not being seen by the people that you want to be
Mm,
vulnerable with versus transparency might just be a moment in time in a conversation, for example,
mm,
where a truth statement is required, right? Something needs to be said in that moment that needs to be said. That's transparency. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on both the
yeah.
difference, but also the relationship between vulnerability and transparency.
That's so good. Yeah. So, I mean, the first thing I'll probably say is like, words often get co-opted by the moment. You know what I mean? Like they get co-opted by the, cultural zeitgeist of the moment. And they'll often mean different things to different people, to different groups, or slightly different things. I think at one point the word transparency was really valuable. Like it's a valuable word, right? It's in its very essence, it's like describing something that is clear enough to see through, right? See behind, see under, see within, see beneath. I think that's a good thing. But again, I think that we've branded these words. We've over branded these words. They mean nothing almost, in our kind of
Wearing them
cultural.
on t-shirts and, we tattoo them on
Yeah,
on
it's
our,
it's everywhere. And it loses its value. And I think the reason it loses its value is because those who use it as their mantra. So I think the reason why they lose their value is because those that use it as their mantra don't live very compelling lives. So to me now, I'm not really sure, and I'm of course making an assessment here, and I could be wrong about this, but they don't live a compelling life in that their life doesn't move the needle on kindness, on compassion, on empathy. When I was a kid, I used to admire really witty people, like people that, yo, they just knew what to say at the right time and they were
yeah,
quick witted. I was like, damn, I really admire that. As I got over, that changed a lot. As I got older, I stopped admiring witty and quick witted people and I started admiring kind people.
Mm,
There's something about people that are kind and compassionate and understanding and flexible and agile that is so compelling to me. And I think oftentimes the reason why those words don't have teeth is because the mouths that are saying it aren't very compelling, that their
mm,
lives aren't very compelling. So that's the
inauthentic.
first thing I'll say. They're actually, the irony is that they're not as authentic as their mantra claims that they are. The other thing I'll say about these words is I think you said it very rightly. The way that I think about this in my head, and again, I'm no expert, but in my life experience, transparency has become to be an activity. Vulnerability is a nature or a disposition that leads to the outcome of intimacy. That's how I think about this,
I love
right?
that.
The
It's an
activity is,
equation.
it's an equation in some senses, right? You act transparently, or you do the act of transparency in large part because you are willing to have the disposition of vulnerability that results in the outcome of intimacy. Because look, bro, I've said this on many different platforms, so this is not public, but I'll never forget, I think it was year 14 of our marriage, and at this point, we've already passed the mark, the 7-year mark, which is where people say, like, that's where marriages really are tested, right? Year 7, year 8. And at this point, we've doubled that. But I'll never forget, we were doing therapy together for no other reason other than we thought therapy together was healthy, not because we were any kind of danger was imminent for us. I'll never forget, my wife was talking to the therapist. We had kind of alone time, and I saw her in the corner, and something was happening to my wife. Therapist was getting in her. And I was like, oh man, this is crazy. I don't know what's going to come of this. Without having to belabor this, we're on the car ride back home from Queens, and my wife is a mess. And I'm just like, honey, what's up? Like, let's talk. Let's talk. And she's like, let's just wait till we get home. And I'm like, oh man. I'm like, I don't even know what's about to happen. Anyways, we get home and she confesses something to me. And in her confession, something that she had been weighing her, that she had been holding on to since her young age. And my wife and I met when I was 19. So I didn't know her when this thing that she confessed happened to her, but it weighed on her. And she said, I was so terrified to share this with you. I was willing to take this to my grave because I just didn't know how you would respond. I thought that me sharing this, your perception of me would change so much that it would jeopardize our marriage. And it was hard to hear. It was really hard to hear what she shared, in large part because I was just sad for her. Like, she
Mm.
had gone through this experience that really, really impacted her negatively. But I was also just like, oh man, she was willing to never tell me this because she was afraid of how I would respond to this thing that she shared. And so I say it was really hard to hear it. But I said to her, I said, honey, by you sharing this with me, you gave me the opportunity to love you. Had you not shared this with me, I would have only loved as authentically and deeply and intensely as I loved her, even at that moment before she shared that with me. I would have only had the opportunity to love the version of her where I didn't know this thing.
An incomplete
It was
version
still
of her.
it was an incomplete version of her. And John Legend was right. All of me. Like, I want you to love all of me is what he sings. You know what I mean? And I said, honey, you gave me that opportunity. And so I say all of that to say, love, as much as I think faith also falls in this category, it's a risk. Love is a risk. No matter how you slice it, no matter how much you philosophize around the idea and experience of love and or faith, it is a risk, because love says all of you has to show up in order to experience deeply. The risk is when you show up all of yourself, the other person who you show up to may choose to not stay.
Mm,
They may choose to not stay. The way that I've tried to, like, practically define this for myself as it relates to vulnerability, intimacy, and transparency. My wife acted transparently. She allowed herself to be so clear that I can see through her, right? And that came from her disposition to be vulnerable, to put herself in a very weak point. The weak point being he can choose to love me or he can choose to leave me. That's what that disposition of vulnerability allowed her to do. It allowed her to be transparent, to allow me to see right through her. The outcome could have been me leaving and saying, this is too much. I don't know that I can handle this. Love is to give to someone or to some group of people. Love is to give to someone or to some group of people the very things that they can use to hurt you, but instead they love you. I have to put in the hands of this person. What Anna did when she told me that is she said, Rich, open your hands. I'm about to give you something that you can use to hurt me. And I'm just hoping that you use it to love me.
Mm.
So she took a real risk. She took a real risk to tell me what she told me, but she was motivated by vulnerability. She acted transparently, and and the undertone of both of those things, I think, was hope. She hoped. She believed in something that told her that she can trust that I would not use it to harm her. And I didn't. I didn't use it
Mm.
to harm her. And instead, I used it to draw closer to her. And I think that that is what happens when someone acts transparently, inspired by their willingness to be vulnerable. You give someone access to yourself. And in my book, intimacy is nothing more and nothing less than access. Can you get access to this person? I'm not talking about the person that they've constructed, the image, and I'm saying, can you get close to them, to the things that they've worked really hard to hide, to the decisions that they've made to cover all of that up? Can you get close behind the curtain? Can you get close? If you can, that's access. And I think that that's the outcome of someone being vulnerable and acting transparently. So the relationship to me between those three things, they play with each other. They're different, but they play with each other. And I think I've seen it most powerfully in my relationship with my wife. And again, to anyone that's listening that's not married, yourself included, you know what I'm saying? Like I think we've had to talk about this very carefully, especially when I was a pastor, because I think, again, I ascribe to the Christian faith. I think Christians are not very good at this. We talk about marriage as if it were the pinnacle of human existence. Like, this is what you have to, kind of assent to be the fullest version of what God intended. You need to be married. I will say, I think that marriage gives a very unique picture of life, and it invites you into very unique things. But I don't think that those that are married are varsity and those that are not married are JV. You know what I mean? I think that's a really, really, really warped way of understanding relationship. And in fact, I think my faith traditions actually says the opposite, because, Jesus was unmarried and yet he's the highest,
Yeah.
in my
Isn't that
estimations, he's the highest depiction of
yeah.
what we were called to be. You know what I mean? So anyway,
Isn't that ironic, right? Yeah,
isn't
yeah.
it? It's crazy.
How many men would be confronted with something like that or an experience like that? Whatever the theme was, or the topic, the underlying topic was that you had to wrestle with your wife. But in general, how many men confronted with something really difficult in their relationship or in their lives decide to stick with it and stay present with that discomfort and try to work through it and trust that there's growth on the other side of that, versus how many men decide to just, I'm out of here, peace, or I'm going to distract
Yeah.
myself. I'm going to go drink. I'm going to go spend money that I shouldn't. I'm going to risk take. I'm going to women out, whatever it is. And I think, to me, that is sort of one of the foundational elements of what it means to be a man, right? What it means to be a
Mm,
man that stays present, that's able to toggle between tenderness but also strength, the knowing of when to
Mm.
do that. And despite in the immediate term, despite the reward of staying not necessarily being clear, but choosing to do that, despite that, I think is really the character of manhood that one I aspire to achieve, but also sort of what I think is required now in the world, especially, as you know, I do men's work, right? This is my space. And, I'm
That's
not
right. That's
my
right.
work is not about teaching men anything. It's not about teaching men how to be better husbands, better fathers, better boyfriends, whatever. It's really by modeling behavior, by creating spaces for men to be our fullest expressions, to then say what's possible, right? What does it look like for you to embrace the fullness of who you are as a
Oh,
human being first and then a man and then everything else? What does that look like? And how does the fear feel in your body? How does that feel? How does it motivate you? How does it make you freeze? And how do you decide in that moment to still move forward or not? And I wonder, just going back to even just your time as a pastor and deciding to leave the ministry, what did you realize when you left that you were still carrying as a man? And I think the same thing applies when, you transition from your career to what you're doing now. It's in both instances, you decided to leave something and shed old skin, so to
mhm.
speak, and step into a newness of becoming, if you will. And in both instances, I'm sure it wasn't easy. So what did you learn and where did you draw the strength to continue to move forward despite the future being opaque?
Man, that's a fantastic question. Even taking a few steps back, thinking about that interaction that I had with my wife, and I'll talk a little bit about what something that my wife and I called our change philosophy. Something that I could have stayed, I did stay, I could have left in that scenario with my wife. And you posed the rhetorical question, man, I wonder how many men would have, how would the majority of men respond to that and why? I think we could have done something worse, which is to stay and act like if nothing happened, to
Right.
stay after hearing your wife show up fully, or this person that you are intimate with show up fully, and just move forward as if she just didn't expose herself to you. And I think that the biggest temptation to that is our lack of language for an emotional healthy spirituality. Like,
Mm.
we just don't have the tools. I think that in the last several years, that's been a topic of conversation broadly about emotional well-being, but particularly even for men, having this conversation about how do we acknowledge, how do we name that emotionally we're not well? Where do we go for the tools, and what do we envision for ourselves as far as our emotional health is concerned? Like, that's a, I would argue, a more recent conversation. But I think generally, even in thinking about our parents' generation, like, they just did not have the tools to think about this stuff. So I think that also has something to do with how to answer this other question about what did I learn about myself in the pivot, but particularly, like, I think that for one, the industry that I was coming out of is not historically known for people leaving it. Not unless not unless it was attached to a scandal. So I think, I mean, I don't know if you've seen this recently, but the Drewski just dropped
Yeah.
a sketch last night.
He's
I
hanging
don't know
at a
if you've
mega
seen
church.
it.
He's like hanging. Yeah, it's hilarious.
Oh, dude. Look, I don't know if I'll get in trouble for this or not, but it is funny. It is funny. And I mean, I was not a mega church pastor, but I was around many, and it's kind of wildly accurate. So think that the industry I was coming out of as a pastor, you just don't see a lot of people leaving it. Like, this is kind of like a you die a pastor type numbers. So I think I had to first give myself, or find for myself, the permission to leave.
Mm.
So even before I left and had to process the leaving and the changing, I had to first accept that it was okay to leave without feeling the shame and the guilt of leaving this. Because this is not, I mean, I'm talking about it in terms of industry and work, but people in that industry would not necessarily call it an industry. This is sacred. And it is. And it is. It's a very sacred work. In the same way that I think teachers are sacred work, in the same way that I think social workers are sacred work. Anything that's people facing for the most part feels like very sacred work. But most people don't think about religious work that way. This is like a high sacred calling. And I had to find the permission for myself to say, dude, it's okay to leave. And for at least for the first 3 years, I didn't feel that, bro. I felt
Mm,
like I was letting God down by leaving. So I had to
mm.
wrestle with that guilt. I had to wrestle with that shame. And my community and my wife, again, were instrumental to, and my therapist were very instrumental to helping me kind of shed that. You know what I mean?
Was there any
But
pressure
once I
from
did do that,
your maybe your family or your parents in that?
no, no, not at all, man. I don't come from a line of religious working people. I mean, I barely come from a line of religious people,
Okay.
let alone people that work in the ministry. So no one batted an eye. Also, my decision to leave was very layered. I didn't leave simply because I felt a change of heart and I wanted to try something new. I also left because I was very tired. The work, again, anything people facing is incredibly demanding. And look, I'll say this on record. I love what I did. I know that talking about faith is not the easiest topic, in our modern culture, but I love what I did. And I loved being with people and I loved walking alongside people. And I loved, this is going to sound crazy, but I loved sitting across the table from a couple that was experiencing challenges and on the brink of divorce. I loved that I got the opportunity, despite the fact that this is very, very difficult, but I loved the opportunity of sitting at a hospital bed with somebody that's very ill. I
Mm,
loved that I got the chance to do that, but I was very tired. I was very tired. And so my leaving was also very layered. But once I did leave, I not only had to find the permission to say it's okay to leave, but I also had to give and find. I say find because I don't necessarily think I give myself the permission as much as I discover that I have permission. I had to find the permission that it was okay to change. That at the time I was 38, I'll be 42 in a few weeks, like that it's okay to pivot at this stage, that it's okay to evolve. And I won't speak generally about this. I'll only speak about the kind of tradition and culture that I was part of. But we don't talk a lot about change. We don't see it in our families. I mean, I certainly didn't see it in my parents. They lived a certain way. They had certain things that was really important to them. My dad was an artist in DR. Guitarra, he was part of a little conjunto. And I didn't learn this about him until a few years ago. And I said, Bob, what happened? He's like, what you mean? I came here. I had to work. I had to raise you guys. I loved every bit of it. I left that life back there. The idea of change is such a difficult thing to have to process in general, but in specific for seasons like pivoting, like the ones that I've experienced, the ones that you've talked about, because change reminds us that our life is moving along. And when our life is moving along, it means it's getting closer to the end. And that's a very sobering thing to have to confront. And so I think we don't naturally incline ourselves to change for that and other reasons. And I think that my wife and I talk about change philosophy. And part of what we say with that is we are ever evolving. My wife and I have a podcast called Becoming Ourselves, where we talk about what it means to age, get older, and hit midlife. And our relationship with our kids changes. The moment my son got his driver's license, the relationship changed. He's about to be 18 in a few months and go off to college. It'll change again. My daughter is approaching 14. Her body is changing. Her emotions are changing. Her relationship to us is changing. In 4 or 5 years' time, both of our kids will be out the house and it will just be my wife and I. We will have to change. You know what I'm saying? Like we are ever evolving. My wife says this very simply all the time. She's like, our son will come up to us and say, hey, I want to do X, Y, Z. I'm going to drive to my homie's house. And my wife would look at me, she's like, "What do you wanna do?" And I'm like, "I don't know, I've never had a 17-year-old before, like, I don't know what to do here."
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But every single day is new and fresh, and I think that, it says also something about our faith and its usefulness, if I can put it that way. I don't wanna make God utilitarian, but I do think that the impact of faith in God is useful to me in so many ways. But I think even most pertinently here, like, I'm afraid to change because I'm not sure that I can keep my life in control if things change too much. Well, my faith invites me to relinquish control in the most fundamental ways. And I have to trust that despite the fact that I may not have full control of the way my life may turn out, that I'm invited to trust in a God who does have control of my life and how it may turn out. And I'm invited to trust in that God. But I don't think we naturally incline ourselves to change, bro. And over the last few years, I've had to say, hey, you can explore being a filmmaker. That's okay. You know, you can explore your even the way that you think about your faith changes. I had to find that permission for myself. Like, hey,
Yeah.
your views here, your views there, your values here, they shift, they change, they move, they evolve. The tectonic plates beneath you shift. Here's this one thing that feels like a constant, your faith in this God. Hold on to that and trust him with everything else that's changing around your life. So I just don't think we incline ourselves to change very often because of what it reminds us of.
Yeah. Um, Real quick, looking at time, I know we're over the hour, and I have two more segments that I want to get over. Are you cool with time? Maybe another 10 minutes or so?
Yeah,
Awesome.
I'm good. I'm good, bro.
Awesome. Rich, that's a great segue into a segment that let me rephrase that. Rich, that's a great segue into a segment that I have called Say It or Skip It. So I'm going to throw out some prompts and you can decide to say it or you can skip it. You don't have to explain. You ready?
Okay.
All right. A belief about love you've had to unlearn.
That it's purely sentimental.
A moment that reshaped how you think about faith or belonging.
When I decided to stop being a pastor.
What's a version of success that no longer fits you?
High production.
And what's something that you're still figuring out in your life?
My vocation.
Amazing. Yeah. So I want to go back to love for a minute and talking about this love ethos that you have of loving with eyes wide open. You know, throughout this entire conversations, you've given us multiple examples of what that looks like. But I want to dig a little bit deeper and talk about what's required of someone to live and to love with eyes wide open. So in your opinion, what do you think is required for someone to live in that way?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. I mean, yeah, I don't wanna sound like a broken record, but I'll start by saying all of you. If one wants to experience the fullness of what love in its truest expression has to offer, then you have to fully show up. Otherwise, you cannot possibly experience the fullness of love. It requires all of you. And that's what's terrifying about love. That's what's terrifying about intimacy and experiencing it.
Mhm.
You just you forfeit the depth of what love wants to give when you choose to reserve a portion of yourself when you show up to the space. It's like I'm gonna show up, but I'm gonna leave this part of me out. And love is like, well, I think you also forfeit the fullest expression of what I want to give you
Mm.
if you do that. And so I think that what love requires is courage. Love requires courage. It
That
demands it.
that's a capital C. Yeah, it demands it. And, I think unfortunately we talk about love so much online in these spaces and we romanticize it, but we don't realize how much work it takes, right? So going back to the earlier part of a conversation, it's a choice and it's a choice that isn't as frivolous as saying, what are you wearing today? It's who are you being today that it requires.
Bro, I think that I wrote this in a journal not too long ago, in a journal entry. And I shared it with my wife and, she just laughed. But I said, I'm kind of I'm kind of tired of saying I love you. And what I mean by that is I love you holds little to no weight without expression. To your point earlier about bell hooks, little to no weight. They're just words. I would rather my wife, and this is me being very extreme, and this is why I said my wife laughed when I shared this with her. But I would rather my wife express her love to me than to say them, because anyone can say any words, but only those that are committed to the pursuit of access will endeavor to express the deep requirements of love. So I'm like, oh, I'd rather do the things that communicate love to you than to say it, because I want you, and I've shared this about my wife and about my kids, like, I want there to be no shadow of a doubt. You know that the saying that people say, you'll never know how much I love you. I hate that phrase. I hate that saying,
Yeah,
because I want to live a life where you have no shadow of a doubt how much I love you, because I think you deserve it. You deserve to know how much I love you. There may be moments where I'm at a loss for words on how to express it. There may be moments where it's like, oh man, but I never want my wife to guess how much I love her. I don't want my love to be guesswork for any of the people that I feel deeply about. I want it to be very clear how much I love you. And that's not going to happen by virtue of how many times I say it. This is not a volume metric. This is an expression metric.
hmm
They're going to know by virtue of how committed I was to expressing the thing that I said I had for them.
I love it. All right, brother. Well, let's end it with this. As you know, with my work, part of what we're trying to do is sort of encourage men to examine themselves deeply, right? Clearly, work that you and I are in the midst of doing. And in doing that, it's recognizing that society has given us a script about what it means to be a man. And we're all rewriting the script for ourselves. So the last question I have
Mm.
for you is, what is the script that you have been given about what it means to be Rich Perez? And then what is let me ask that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
How do I say it? Okay. Our brother. So I want to end with this question
Go
because,
for
as
it.
you know, my work is about self-reflection and doing the type of work that's required to meet ourselves as men more deeply. And inevitably, when you do that work, you arrive at this knowing that you have been given a script by things outside of yourself, by your family, et cetera, about what it means to be a man and what it means to be you. And so I'd like to ask you that question. What script have you been given about being a man? And what script are you rewriting for yourself
Ah,
right now?
I think they're both the same. I think the answer to both of those are the same for me, at least in this season. There's an ancient prayer that says, surely You desire integrity in my inner self, and you teach me wisdom deep within me. I think that as I live in this world and think about what it means to be Rich Perez and what it means to be a man in particular, and what it means to even raise a young man in Josiah, my son, I want my primary thrust and effort to be in the direction of being a person of integrity, a person who is focused on making sure that the foundation of their inner self is built and constructed with great integrity. And simply what that means is that I'm okay at any juncture of my life to be the same person in public that I am in private. No matter how ugly or great I think that version inward, my inner self is, I want to be a person that's okay with saying, look, I'm not going to pretend to be something that I'm not. In this season of my life, I'm doubtful, I'm jagged, I'm sad, I'm broken. I'm not going to pretend to be anything else because then it compromises the integrity that's trying to take shape inside of me. I need to be these things consistently inside and out because I believe when that prayer says that you desire integrity in my inner self, it's a direct connection to my thoughts and my emotions. That part of what that person praying that prayer is saying is your thoughts and your emotions are as important to who you become as anything else, as the effort that you put into work, as the effort that you put into your IP and your creativity and your production, as the effort that you put into your relationship. No, how you relate to yourself and to, in my worldview, the God that created you is as important as anything else. How you feel about yourself, how you think about yourself is deeply important. And if you're going to be a person that has any shred of integrity, you're going to be okay with that version of yourself so that you can continue to grow and evolve in the direction that the divine wants you to grow in. And I want the same thing for my kid. I want the same thing for my kids, my family, my people. But again, in the context of men, I want that for my son because we've been handed a very different script in culture. We've been handed a script in culture that says that we should not think so deeply about our emotions. Whereas I think that our emotions, though not dictators, they should be collaborators of ours. And so that's the script I want to tell them. That's the script I want to live with. That's the one that I want to follow. And I want to be a method actor of that script.
I love that. I love that. Well, Rich, thank you for the conversation, my brother. I'm grateful for the discussion, the transparency, and the vulnerability. I'm grateful to be on this journey with you, bro. So thank you for trusting me to have this conversation.
Dude, shouts to you. I love everything that you're doing. Always praying for the lives of men. It's a great movement.
Thank you, brother. All right.